Hey, my name is Eric, and today I'm building a 3D wood and epoxy lake map. Let's get to work. Okay, like all projects, this one starts with a little bit of inspiration. So I've got 3 different maps here, all pretty similar in design, but they do have some differences. Okay, let's start off by talking about the overall complexity of these maps. I'd imagine that most of these maps are either laser cut or made with a CNC machine, which I don't have. I'm gonna try hand routing this thing. Because of that, I'm gonna want mine to be pretty simple. I'm gonna want it to focus primarily on the lake itself. So if we look at these maps, they obviously have the shape of the lake, but they also have a lot of other detail with lettering and roads and things that I'm gonna avoid with my map. So that's the first thing I'm gonna focus on, is keeping it simple. Okay, next thing is the overall color choices. So the map on this side and the map on this side are both light wood on dark wood. This one here in the center is a medium wood on a medium wood. I personally like the contrast. I'm gonna go with a light wood base with a dark wood frame. Okay, so I'm not positive how these maps are made, and I think that each of these are actually different layers of wood that are somewhat laminated together. I'm gonna try to take a different approach and use one solid block of wood and router out layer by layer. Okay, lastly, let's look at the water itself. I like that this is blue, I like that this is blue, and while I don't necessarily dislike the fact that they kept this one brown, I personally like the blue a little bit more. The other thing that I see is that these are essentially big voids in the map where the material is missing. I think I'm gonna try to fill mine with epoxy. So instead of painting these blue, I'm gonna fill this void in with a dyed blue epoxy. Okay, with those 4 simple points, let's get to designing. Okay, so for this design, I'm gonna start with plain boards that I'm going to laminate together to make my main work surface. Okay, so the lake that I'm gonna be designing is Lake Winnisquam up in New Hampshire. And the deepest part of Lake Winnisquam is 150 feet. And I'm gonna have about an inch of wood to work with, so the game plan is gonna be to remove 1/8 of an inch of material for every 25 feet of depth. We know our top layer is going to be 0 feet. That means our first layer at 1/8 of an inch deep is going to be 25 feet. 1/4 of an inch is going to be 50 feet. 3/8 of an inch is going to be 75 feet. 1/2 an inch is going to be 100 feet. 5/8 of an inch is going to be 125 feet. And 3/4 of an inch is going to be 150 feet, the deepest part of the lake. Okay, the game plan from here is going to be to trace the outline of my lake onto the board and color code each depth with a different color. This way, if I zoom in on the side of my board, I'll essentially have a bunch of different layers of 1/8 inch deeper every time. And the wood will be cut out to correspond to the deepest part of the lake. Now, I'm not gonna do any roads or anything like that, but I will try to put the name of the lake up here. And if I feel like getting fancy, put some sort of compass or something down at the bottom. Okay, as for the frame itself, really basic stuff. I'm gonna take my board and I'm gonna make a cut in it to remove some material. And then take my artwork and place it inside. I'll try to leave enough space at the bottom for a backing board and some mechanical hardware back here to hold the piece in place. Then it'll just be a matter of mitering my corners to 45 degrees. And then building out the rest of this frame. A frame in the most basic of senses. That's the plan. Get to work. Okay, so for this project, I'm going to use ash. Partially because it's a light color wood, partially because it's all that I have in my garage. I'll cut these boards to length, glue them up, give them a squeeze, and let them dry. With everything drying, I can begin to prepare the template. For this, I went to a website called gpsnauticalcharts.com and pulled off a map that showed the overall depths. I then used my iPad to trace the outline of the lake, coloring in the first depth white. I then unclicked that layer and made another layer, coloring in the next depth blue. Unclicked that layer and made another layer, coloring the next depth orange, and so on and so on. I repeated this process 6 times and then could turn on each layer again, turn off the map layer, and I had my template. I could then print it out, tape it together, and get to work. Then once dry, I'll spend a minute sanding it to get it smooth. Then using the worst can of spray glue in existence, I'll glue on my template. Okay, so for the router bits, I've got a few choices. I've got a straight cut, which, as you'd imagine, will make a very straight cut. I've got a 90-degree bit that'll give me a very pointed edge, meaning a little bit of a slope. I've got a 60-degree bit that's the same concept, but a much steeper slope. And then I've got this ultra-fine 11-degree bit, which is for really detailed work. I went ahead and ran a few samples on some old scrap wood to see which one I liked the best. When you turn this board on its side, you can start to see where these angles are coming from, with the 11 and the straight being virtually up and down, and the 60 and the 90 giving us the corresponding angles. You can also see how when you go from the 11 to the straight, you lose a lot of detail and start rounding out the edges. I decided to start with the 11-degree, figuring I could always go to a more aggressive bit if I didn't like it. For this project, I'm going to use a plunge router, so I'll go ahead and set the stop. And then adjust it 1/8 of an inch. This way, when I plunge it down, I'll take out 1/8 of an inch of material. For the second pass, I could lower it another 1/8 of an inch, and then when I plunge down, I'll be taking out 1/4 of an inch of material. And then I'll repeat this process as we go. Just so I don't lose track, I'm going to make a few notes. White is 1/8, blue is 1/4, orange 1, 2, 3, and 4 will get 1/8 of an inch deeper each time. Why I chose 4 shades of orange? I don't know, but here we are. Okay, time to route. I'll set the 1/8 inch depth and get to work. The 11-degree bit makes really quick work of this outline, but it is fine. And when I want to take out thicker chunks of material, it definitely takes some time. It works, the concept is there, but it's a bit tedious. And by the time I need to plunge this bit deeper and deeper, I think I'm going to run into some problems. With that, I threw on the 60 degree and figured I'd give it a shot. This bit makes much quicker work of it. It takes out a lot more material, but in the flat areas, the point is still there. And because of that, it leaves a bit of a rough surface, which I didn't love. With that, I decided to go all in and try the straight cut bit, sacrificing a little bit of detail around the edges in exchange for a flat surface. And after the first pass, I feel like I'm onto something. I'll then take a minute to remind myself that this is more of an art piece and not an actual map, and that loosely sketching on the next layer will probably work just fine. So with that, I draw on all the blue, mark it off, lower my stop to 1/4 of an inch, and start routing. Then it's a matter of rinse and repeat. Sketch and route, going 1/8 of an inch deeper each time. Once I'm done with all 6 passes, I'll sand off the remaining paper. And then use a little sandpaper and a file to remove any burrs. Okay, let's make a frame. The final piece ended up measuring around 11 inches by 17 inches by 1 inch. Now, all the lumber that I have is only 1 inch thick. That means in order to make a frame that overhangs this picture, I need to turn this board on its side and rip them down to 1.5 inch pieces. My thought being I can remove some material and build a little bit of a lip that will overhang this piece. I figured I'd start with a 1 inch cut. That'll leave me 1/2 inch of material on top. That's plenty for 1/4 of an inch overhang on top of the board and another 1/4 of an inch overhang on the bottom of the board that I could put a backing board in place. This might just be easier to show you. There you go. Then it's just a matter of taking some measurements, mitering the corners, and gluing it up. Once dry, I give it a quick sanding, and I've got a pretty okay frame. One of the things when making a frame like this is you are gluing end grain to end grain, which isn't the strongest glue up. Now this is just a frame, it's just gonna hang on the wall, shouldn't be an issue. But in order to add a little bit more glue surface and a pop of color, I'm going to take some of that ash, cut it down, and make a spline. I'm going to use this jig that I made a while ago out of old plywood. It's basically just stacked up, glued at a 45-degree angle. But when you run it through your table saw, that blade will pop through and cut the opening for the spline. I'll kind of eyeball the height of the blade, pop my frame in, and make my cut. Then it's just a matter of gluing these in place, giving it about an hour to dry, and then sawing it down. Quick sanding, and these things look pretty good. Okay, epoxy time. 2-part A and B, and a little bit of powder blue dye. I know that I want this lake to be pretty transparent, so I went really light with the coloring, figuring you could always add more if you needed to. And I did. I poured it in, figured it was way too light, dumped it out, added a little bit more blue, and poured it again. Then I'll use a heat gun to remove the bubbles and let this thing dry. Then once it's all set up, a few passes through the planer will get it nice and flat. Now it's time for the lettering. I printed out a few fonts to see which one I like the most, and once I decided on one, using my upgraded can of spray glue, I'll glue it to the board. Then I'll take that 60-degree router bit and route out my letters. I freehand the straight lines for the compass, and then using a hole saw on the drill press, I'll give it a little bit of a circular design. And now it's time to color them in. I'm going to use some painter's tape to tape off everything that I don't want to be colored. And then using a can of spray paint, I'll paint right over these letters. Then once that paint dries, you can pop off the tape and hit it with the sander. This will remove all the paint from the surface, but leave the paint inside the lettering. then for some of the finer details, I'm going to use this wood burner. All right, the backing board is really simple. I'm going to cut my 1/4 inch piece to size and then measure out where I want the hardware to go, pre-drill the holes, make sure it works, and then take it all apart. From there, I'm going to hit it with its final sanding, 220 on the frame and 400 grit on the surface of the lake. Quick wipe with a tack cloth, and it is time to finish it. Okay, for the finish, I am using Rubio Monocoat applied with a foam tip brush. Put it on fairly liberally. Give it a little bit of time to dry, and then with a clean cloth, wipe it off. Just like that. This one's done.